in the autumn of 336 BC, the theatre of Aigai was filled with the elite of Macedonia, gathered to celebrate the marriage of King Philip II's daughter. As the monarch entered the arena, purposely walking ahead of his bodyguards to demonstrate his perceived security, a young man named Pausanias stepped from the shadows. In a single blurred motion, a Celtic dagger was driven into the king's ribs. Philip, the man who had transformed Macedonia from a backwater into the master of Greece, collapsed and died in the dust. In the chaotic hours that followed, the crown was thrust upon his 20-year-old son, Alexander. He inherited a professional army and a fragile hegemony, but he also inherited a world that believed the Macedonian sunrise had ended with his father's heartbeat. Across the Danube to the north and the plains of Boeotia to the south, the enemies of the Argead house began to stir. Convinced that a boy king could not hold the iron grip Philip had spent decades tightening, Alexander would not wait for the storm to break. Within months, he would launch a series of lightning campaigns from the heights of the Balkans to the gates of Thebes, proving to the Greek Whig that, while the father was dead, the son was far more dangerous. Welcome to our video on Alexander's Balkan Campaign, the brutal consolidation of power that secured the Macedonian rear before the invasion of Asia. Leadership in the ancient world was a precarious commodity, balanced on the edge of a blade, and the loyalty of one's inner circle. Alexander's survival during these first months depended on his ability to outthink and outmaneuver rivals who had spent years in his father's shadow. This capacity for long-term strategic planning and decisive action is not merely a historical relic. It is a skill that remains essential for anyone navigating the complexities of the modern era. Whether you are managing a team or securing your own future, having the right tools to execute your vision is paramount. If you enjoy the deep dive into military systems and the mechanics of power we provide here, you can find much more on our Patreon and YouTube membership pages. By supporting the channel, you gain access to a massive library of exclusive content, including our multi-part series on the Pacific War, the exhaustive history of the Punic Wars, the Reconquista, the Russian Civil War, the Spanish War of Succession, and the North African Campaign. Members benefit from early access to all new videos, a dedicated community on Discord, and the ability to vote on the topics of our future documentaries. Your support allows us to maintain the academic rigor and high production standards required to tell these stories with the detail they deserve. You can find the link to join our community in the description below. With his domestic rivals purged and his treasury secured, the young king turned his eyes toward the borders of his realm, where the first cracks in the Macedonian peace were beginning to show. The death of Philip II had left the regional order of the Eastern Mediterranean in a state of sudden, volatile flux. For over 2 decades, Philip had painstakingly constructed a system of Macedonian dominance, primarily through the reform of the infantry and the creation of the Hellenic League. By 336 BC, this hegemony extended from the foothills of the Balkans to the southern reaches of the Peloponnese. Macedonia was no longer a peripheral state. It was a military powerhouse with a professional standing army and a strategic bridgehead already established in Asia Minor. 10,000 veteran troops under the seasoned generals, Parmenion and Attalus, were already across the Hellespont, preparing for a grand crusade against the Persian Empire. However, this entire structure was tied to the personal authority of the king. When Philip was struck down, the various factions within the Greek city-states and the tribal confederations to the north saw not a transition of power, but an opportunity for liberation. The immediate crisis was internal. Alexander's ascension was not guaranteed, and the court at Pella became a theater of swift, ruthless pragmatism. Alexander and his mother, Olympias, moved with surgical precision to eliminate any potential pretenders to the Argead throne. While domestic rivals were executed, the strategic danger lay with Attalus in Asia Minor. Attalus had deep ties to the previous queen's faction, and was reportedly in correspondence with anti-Macedonian elements in Athens. Alexander sent a trusted agent to Parmenian's camp, successfully swaying the senior general to his side. Attalus was assassinated, and the expeditionary force was secured. Yet, as the internal purge concluded, the external geopolitical landscape darkened. In the south, Thebes and Athens began to whisper of revolt, encouraged by rumors that the new king was a mere boy who lacked his father's iron will. In the north, the fierce independent tribes of Thrace and Illyria, who had been forcibly brought into the Macedonian orbit by Philip, stopped their tribute and began to mobilize for war. Alexander's first priority was the stabilization of Greece. In late 336 BC, he marched south with a speed that would become his trademark. Reaching the borders of Thessaly, he found the traditional pass at the Vale of Tempe occupied by a hostile force. Rather than engage in a costly frontal assault, Alexander demonstrated his mechanical approach to warfare. He ordered his men to cut a series of steps into the sheer seaward cliffs of Mount Ossa, creating a path where none existed. When the Thessalonians awoke to find the Macedonian phalanx formed up in their rear, they surrendered without a blow. This maneuver set a psychological precedent. Alexander moved through Thermopylae, where the Amphictyonic Council formally recognized his leadership, and appeared before the gates of Thebes before the city could even organize its defenses. Terrified by his sudden arrival, the Greeks capitulated. Athens sent envoys to profess their loyalty, and at Corinth, the Hellenic League formally confirmed Alexander as the supreme commander for the coming war against Persia. However, a king who could not defend his own frontiers would never be followed into the heart of Asia. To the north, the Danube River acted as a porous barrier between civilization and the tribal wilderness of the Tribalians and the Getae. These groups, along with the Illyrians to the west, represented a significant logistical threat. If Alexander crossed into Persia, these tribes could sweep down into Macedonia, cutting his supply lines and threatening Pella itself. By the spring of 335 BC, it was clear that diplomacy would not suffice. The Tribalian king, Sirmis, had formed a coalition to challenge Macedonian authority, betting that the rugged terrain of the Balkan mountains would neutralize the famed Sarissa phalanx. This was the point of no return. Alexander marched north from Amphipolis with nearly 25,000 men. Entering a landscape of dense forests and narrow passes where the rigid formations of the Greeks had historically struggled, he was not merely seeking to defend his borders. He was seeking to decapitate the northern opposition in a single decisive campaign that would leave his rear secure for the years of campaigning to come. In doing so, he opened a strategic loop that the disgruntled states of southern Greece would watch with bated breath, waiting for any sign of a Macedonian stumble. Alexander's expeditionary force was a finely tuned instrument of war, totaling approximately 12,000 heavy infantry, 8,000 light troops, and 3,000 cavalry. The core of this machine was the Macedonian phalanx. Equipped with the 18-foot sarissa, this pike allowed the infantry to present an impenetrable wall of iron, but its effectiveness relied entirely on cohesion and flat ground. Supporting them were the Hypaspists, an elite flexible infantry unit, and the Agrianians, highly mobile mountain specialists and skirmishers who would prove vital in the broken terrain of the north. The strike element remained the companion cavalry, a heavy shock force capable of shattering enemy lines once the infantry had pinned them in place. Facing them were the tribal confederations of the Balkans, primarily the Thracians, Tribalians and Illyrians. Unlike the Macedonians, these forces relied on individual ferocity, ambush tactics, and the utilization of restrictive terrain. Their doctrine was built on hit-and-run maneuvers and the defense of naturally fortified heights. While they lacked the heavy armor and disciplined drill of the Macedonians, they possessed superior numbers in their home territory and a deep familiarity with the mountain passes. The Thracians, in particular, utilized heavy war wagons not just for transport, but as tactical obstacles and kinetic weapons to be rolled down slopes into advancing enemy files. The geography of the campaign was defined by the Balkan Mountains and the massive barrier of the Danube River, the narrow Shipka Pass, and the dense wooded glens of the Apsus Valley offered the defenders numerous opportunities to trap a larger, more cumbersome army. Successes would depend on command psychology. The tribal leaders, such as King Sirmis of the Tribalians and Cleitus of the Illyrians, were confident, fighting on familiar ground, and believing Alexander's youth signaled inexperience. They operated under the pressure of maintaining tribal prestige through defiance. Conversely, Alexander was driven by a need for absolute speed and psychological dominance. He was aggressive, prone to taking personal risks to inspire his men, and possessed a technical brilliance that allowed him to adapt his father's rigid systems to unconventional environments. The stage was set for a collision between professional military science and raw tribal defiance in the shadow of the peaks. The campaign began in earnest as the Macedonian column wound its way through the dense forests toward the heights of Mount Haemus. Upon reaching the Shipka Pass, the vanguard encountered a formidable Thracian force occupying the high ground. The barbarians had arranged a line of heavy supply wagons along the summit, intending to roll them down the steep incline to shatter the advancing phalanx. Alexander, observing the trap, issued an unprecedented tactical order. He instructed his men that as the wagons descended, those with space must open their ranks to let them pass. Those caught in the direct path were to lie prone and lock their shields over their backs, creating a sloped, armored ramp. As the Thracians released their kinetic barrage, the heavy wagons either whistled through the gaps or bounced harmlessly over the turtle shell of shields. Not a single Macedonian was lost to the ploy. Seizing the moment of barbarian confusion, Alexander's archers unleashed a blistering volley from the right flank, while the king personally led the heavy infantry in a charge that swept the Thracians from the heights. 1,500 defenders were slaughtered, and the mountain pass was cleared. With the gateway to the north open, Alexander pushed toward the Danube to confront the Tribalians. King Sirmis, realizing the Macedonian strength, withdrew his main body to the island of Peuca in the center of the river. However, a second Tribalian force attempted a classic outflanking maneuver, slipping through the woods to strike Alexander's rear. The king reacted with the speed of a veteran, pivoting his entire force to meet the threat. Before the trap could close, he brought his missile troops to the front, peppering the lighter-armed tribesmen with arrows and stones until they were goaded into a premature charge. As the Tribalians emerged from the cover of the woods, the companion cavalry hammered their flanks, while the phalanx ground through their center. 3,000 Tribalians fell in the carnage, against a loss of only 54 Macedonians. Despite this victory, the island of Peuca remained a stalemate. The current was too fierce, and the landing points too narrow for a successful assault. To make matters worse, a massive force of 10,000 Getae infantry and 4,000 cavalry appeared on the opposite bank of the Danube, taunting the Macedonians. It was here that Alexander demonstrated the logistical improvisation that would later conquer Persia. Under the cover of night, his engineers gathered native dugout canoes and stuffed tent skins with hay to act as floats. In a single night, 4,000 infantry and 1,500 cavalry were ferried across the great river. At dawn, the Getae were horrified to see a Macedonian army formed up in the tall grain fields of their own territory. The phalanx flattened the crops with their sarissas as they advanced in an unbreakable line, while Alexander personally led a cavalry charge into the Getae flank. The barbarian line collapsed instantly. The Getae fled into the wilderness, and King Sirmis, seeing the Danube itself had failed to protect him, sent envoys to offer his submission. However, as the northern frontier seemed settled, news arrived of a massive revolt in the west. Cletus, the Illyrian king, had seized the fortress of Pelium and was joined by Glossius of the Taulantians. Alexander raced toward the Apsus Valley, but his aggression nearly led to disaster. After beginning the siege of Pelium, he found himself trapped when Glaucius arrived with a relief force, occupying the surrounding wooded heights. The Macedonians were encircled and their supply lines cut. In this moment of extreme pressure, Alexander resorted to psychological warfare. He formed his phalanx into a massive block 120 ranks deep. In total silence, he conducted an elaborate series of drills, sarissas, rising and falling, the entire mass pivoting in unison with mathematical precision. The barbarians, unnerved by this silent, mechanical display of discipline, wavered. At a prearranged signal, the Macedonians let out a deafening war cry and beat their spears against their shields. The Illyrians fled the heights in panic, allowing Alexander to seize the tactical initiative. To complete the escape, the army had to cross the Apsus River under fire. Alexander utilized field artillery for the first time in history, setting up catapults on the bank to provide covering fire against the tribesmen. Once across, he waited 3 days for the Illyrians to grow complacent. Scouting reports indicated the barbarians were celebrating, keeping no sentries and digging no trenches. On the 4th night, Alexander led a hand-picked force back across the river. They fell upon the sleeping camp with the Agrianians in the lead, turning the Illyrian position into a slaughterhouse. Cletus was forced to burn his own fortress and flee into the mountains. Just as the Balkan tribes were finally broken, a messenger arrived with dire news from the south. A rumor had reached Greece that Alexander had been killed on the Danube. Thebes was in open revolt, and the strategic loop opened at the start of the campaign was now threatening to strangle the Macedonian throne. Alexander did not hesitate. He turned his exhausted army south, covering 250 miles of mountain terrain in just 14 days. When he appeared before the walls of Thebes in September 335 BC, the rebels could scarcely believe their eyes. The boy king was not dead. He was at their gates. The destruction of Thebes was a calculated act of state terror that fundamentally altered the political landscape of Greece. 6,000 Thebans lay dead in the streets, and 30,000 survivors were herded into the slave markets of the Mediterranean. By delegating the final sentence to the Boeotian allies, Thebes' traditional enemies, Alexander ensured that the blood was shared by the Greeks themselves, effectively compromising the Hellenic League in his own crime. The city was razed to the ground, with only the house of the poet Pindar spared, leaving a literal and metaphorical vacuum in the heart of Greece. In the immediate aftermath, the anti-Macedonian fervor in Athens and the Peloponnese evaporated, replaced by a paralyzed sullen compliance. The strategic loop opened at the start of the Balkan Campaign was now closed. The northern tribes were decimated, and the southern cities were cowed into silence. The short-term political shift was absolute. Alexander demanded the surrender of anti-Macedonian orators, but in a rare moment of diplomatic restraint, he allowed Athens to retain its leaders. Realizing that a functioning, if fearful, Athens was more useful than a second ruin, long-term, The campaign validated the military reforms of Philip II and proved that Alexander possessed a tactical flexibility that surpassed his father. He had successfully employed field artillery, executed a nighttime amphibious crossing of the Danube, and mastered the logistics of rapid mountain warfare. The Balkan campaign had transformed a contested succession into an unchallenged autocracy. With the European frontier stabilized and the Greek rear silenced by the ghost of Thebes, the fragile alliance of the Hellenic League was finally forced to look toward the east. The path to the Hellespont was clear, and the seed of the Persian invasion, planted years prior, was now ready to germinate under the command of a king who had proven he would stop at nothing to maintain his grip on power. The rapid suppression of the Balkan tribes and the total annihilation of Thebes served as a grim prologue to the greatest military undertaking in human history. With his authority absolute and his borders secured, the young king was finally free to turn his gaze across the Hellespont toward the ancient enemy of the Greeks. In our next episode, we will follow Alexander as he crosses into Asia Minor to face the Persian satraps at the Battle of the Granicus. If you want to see more deep dives into the military systems of the ancient world, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified when the next part of this series drops. We extend a special thanks to our Patreons and YouTube members, whose support makes these long-form documentaries possible. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.